In the damp cabin where a stand of pines sealed the sky like a lid, Allison staged a ritual she believed would stamp her claim on Chelsea's life. A white cloth spread over a dark wooden table, 2 scented candles burned down so the smoke curled like invisible ribbons, a bundle of wildflowers tied with twine, and a phone fixed to a tripod staring at the empty center of the room, its small red light blinking with the patience of a lens that registers every breath and twitch. There was no officiant, no agency, no witness other than the unblinking camera. Yet Allison had prepared the scene as if it could confer status, a choreography equal parts obsession and control. She had downloaded a template of a marriage certificate, pre-filled names and dates, and queued up a pre-recorded clip from a generic ceremony stream that, spliced at the right moments, might fool an outsider into believing the rites were recognized remotely. In reality, it was a collage of borrowed images bent to her narrative. What Allison sought was not legal standing but psychological capture. The sense that a line had been crossed, that Chelsea had been coerced into a moment with a frame around it, and that the footage could be wielded like a cord around her mind, a threat replayable whenever resistance surfaced. From the start, Allison layered her aims. The first layer was immediate compliance. The second was a future weapon. The third was an exportable story, something she could tell anyone who challenged her version of reality, insisting this was a voluntary bond and that consent lived in pixels. Alongside the tripod and phone, she taped a thumb-sized recorder beneath the table to harvest clean audio in case the video shook or blurred. She wanted every data stream aligned to the same time mark, a sealed clockwork of evidence meant to drown dissent in a maze of specifics. Yet the right was only a preface, and only when Allison pivoted to the demand for a wedding night did her deeper calculus show. She understood a faux ceremony could not alone hold a stubborn mind like Chelsea's, so she pushed the story toward the realm of traces, the realm that forensic work reads and interprets across many branching possibilities. In Allison's head, at least 3 paths lay open. If fear snapped Chelsea into compliance, Allison would have external markers of intimacy to sculpt a tale of a consummated relationship, muddying any future accusation into a private dispute between 2 adults. If Chelsea fought and injury followed, Allison could rename bruises as the fallout of jealousy or even stage a claim of self-defense, with the lens cropped to give her advantage. And if chaos overtook everything, she would at least have seeded a blend of biological traces capable of fogging the scene, forcing any inquiry to thread a thicket of noise. This shift from coerced vows to the wedding night, therefore, was not a spasm. It was a planned escalation, a psychological hobble designed to drive Chelsea to a cliff where every choice ended in an outcome Allison had budgeted for. The question of the knife's arrival had an answer embedded in the room's layout. It lay hidden under the cloth in a slim wooden box, the blade a dull gleam, a string of shallow marks etched along the spine that read like a batch code, the handle wrapped in walnut with a small stamped insignia belonging to a rural bait and outfitting shop north of the Virginia woods. A salesman had offered to laser initial the handle, a touch of personalization, and Allison had refused to avoid a straight line back to her name. She kept the manufacturer's marking intact instead, a calculated hedge that made the knife appear as something anyone could have purchased. The box smelled of oil, suggesting regular wiping, and tiny fibers were trapped in the pivot screw grooves, evidence of someone who tried to erase prints with cloth. Violence had always been seeded into the scene, not as an accident but as a preset, though Allison hid that seed beneath the calm of ritual. Chelsea's refusal simply tripped the switch. In Allison's distorted logic, the blade was an instrument for restoring order. Her grip tightened not because she had lost control entirely, but because the script had reached the moment where an open threat should compel the captive to realign. Even so, the plan was not sealed. The shop had shipped the knife in-state weeks earlier. A tracking number sat in the store's records. That shallow etch along the spine matched a distributor's batch registry. Patients could connect those dots to a pickup under a false name at a temporary locker, and a warehouse camera might reveal a figure in a knit cap and dark mask with a distinctive tilt to her stance. Scrubbing oils seldom clean every ridge. Near the guard, a dried sheen of salt hinted at skin debris, something a meticulous team would find. Chelsea did not first see the knife in Allison's upraised fist. She saw it as the candlelight slid along the edge and flashed, a thin mercury line. The truth of the ritual snapped into view. A theater of props anchored by a performer intent on completing her tragedy. Chelsea's stance shifted from managing panic to mapping exit vectors. The power strip at the baseboard looked reachable. If she yanked the cord, the tripod would tip, the phone would tumble, the video would freeze, and the mind cord Allison had braided would knot upon itself. But a lunge could also pull the blade nearer, and she calculated again. At that same moment, miles away, Kat and Jacob sped in a borrowed car while Madison in the back seat hugged a canvas-wrapped notebook they had pulled from a false back in Allison's room. It was not a diary in any ordinary sense, but a stack of fragments and clippings, corners of paper and small photographs of a white-painted house on a hillside, annotated with seasonal notes about red leaves and apple scents, a grandmother rarely mentioned yet omnipresent like a background hum. The word Virginia reappeared, ink faded, beside approximate autumn dates. The decisive clue for Kat was a torn utility bill still showing a customer string and a creek name. Madison photographed it, reverse-engineered the number pattern used by a local water company, and cross-checked a handful of towns along a national forest edge, narrowing to a dirt road where fields gave way to scrub. When the pieces aligned enough to risk a drive, Kat messaged her family with a planned route and a likely address, promising to transmit the exact pin the moment they spotted signage. The road was narrow and broken, and a truck's oncoming high beams sliced the night like steel. Jacob swerved a crater at the same instant the truck drifted into their lane to pass a slower vehicle. The world pitched in a brief chain of angles, a time warp tight enough to compress all rescue plans into the hiss of tires and the thrum of metal. Kat's phone bounced off its mount, skittered across the floor mat. The screen flickered, then went dark, and the signal dropped as if a whisper were sucked out of the air. She reached to retrieve it as grit and dead leaves cycloned across the windshield in the truck's wake, and Jacob had to square both hands on the wheel to keep them from sliding into a ditch. A lost signal is more than a technical state. It is the severing of a lifeline for everyone waiting on the other end. The Dupree household waited with a heat that felt like boiling in place. The unsent pin languished in drafts. The map showed a stubborn blue dot at the forest margin as if the car had stepped off the world. Nicole read a chopped alert about a possible accident. Her stomach cinched, every nearby sound muffled under a thick hush, and her body folded before her mind labeled the fall. When people rushed toward her, names collided into a fog. The worst part was not ignorance of the exact location, but knowing time was eroding every chance to intervene. Madison's grip tightened on the notebook as if its weight pinned the car to the dirt. She told Jacob to keep moving because every minute hardened the lock around Chelsea. He nodded with the resolve of someone who has crossed the threshold of fear, and he began to read the roadside as if it were a code. Old paint blazes on pine trunks, a splintered plank pointing toward a dead farm, a break in a fence opening to a track. Kat rebooted the phone, set it to low power, and let it hunt the network. The hills breathed a faint signal up like a runner's breath. She marked elapsed time and distance, built an inferred coordinate chain, ready to fire once a bar appeared. There would be no second collapse. Inside the cabin, Allison re-angled the phone lower to include the floorboards, curating her film so every frame served as evidence. She tugged the white cloth toward the center to stage a clean contrast against the dark knife, not just for impact but to make any later staining pop on camera. Chelsea understood the masquerade was no longer symbolic. The board was set so every piece would etch a line into the wood. She edged half a step back, measured the drop from heel to threshold, estimated whether a kick tripod would send the phone into the socket with enough force to sever power, calculated whether those borrowed seconds would be enough to sprint for the window latch. Allison had not left windows as exits. The door lock was reefed tight, the sash barred, and the single key hung in a coat pocket on a nail above Chelsea's head, close enough to tease the sense of reachability, far enough to stay out of grasp. The ticking wall clock sounded dry and hollow, each stroke like dust settling in a lung, while across town the outfitter's clerk locked up, unaware his spring sale had dropped a tiny pin into a thread that connected strangers. Allison pushed everything to the lip of endurance, then relaxed her grip, a conditioning trick to teach compliance, something learned in the long apprenticeship of being abandoned. She believed if she induced maximum panic, then offered a counterfeit escape, Chelsea would slip into the captor's orbit of gratitude and begin rationalizing captivity. If resolve held, Allison would switch scripts. In the violent version, she favored prelude over crescendo, a shallow slice to paint cooperation onto the cloth for the lens, a shove hard enough to bruise but not to break, a maneuver that declared her the injured party if the narrative needed flipping. She had even considered how to plant Chelsea's prints on the handle, a quick live-fire test of reflexes by tossing the knife toward her so instinct might curl fingers around the danger. Chelsea refused the reflex. She let metal clatter, the blade burying itself in the plank and springing with a bright note, then pivoted and dragged the tripod, toppling it in a tangle. The phone yawed, candles shivered, the video glimpsed slashes of light and fell out. Chelsea dove for the power strip, yanked the plug, and a blue spark bit the air as the warm smell of singed plastic spilled. Allison lunged to salvage the phone, but the cord lay slack and the record cut, and that absence of surveillance opened a seam in the control fabric. Chelsea did not sprint for the door. She jumped for the nailed coat. She hooked a shelf edge, leveraged upward, and scraped finger pads along the pocket seam until the key scraped loose and rang on the floor. Allison grabbed for her with the weight of her body. They rolled across a thin rug, dragged skin on wood, a slim red arc blooming at the cloth's edge, unclear whose abrasion painted it, sufficient to mark that the board had entered a blooded state. Out on the dirt lane, Jacob crested a low ridge above a shallow slope. One bar blinked, then two. Kat sent the coordinate packet with a terse line naming the last signpost, just enough for someone at home to alert local patrol. Those at home received it like a thrown rope. Nicole, stirring through the fog, found her own phone by touch and dialed the person most able to move now. Each call pushed the search wheel another notch toward the trees. In the back seat, Madison reread a passage in the notebook describing apple preserves and a carved fish on a post by a creek. After the turn, they saw a grayed board with a still visible fish in relief. Jacob eased off the gas, swung into the track, rolled slow over a bowed plank bridge. At the end stood a white house that rose from the dark like an antique fairy tale warped by damp. A weak rectangle of warm light seeped through a shutter crack. Jacob cut the headlights far out, coasted, and killed the engine. Cold air licked their tongues. They had none of the state's authority, only the particular resolve of those who have traveled from doubt to absolute conviction. Inside, Allison tried to reassert staging, plugging in, righting the legs, while Chelsea folded into the corner, palm tight on the key. The door was old and swollen, the lock crusted, but the metal in her hand was a symbol of agency and not yet an exit. She held a beat longer, testing whether the footfall she thought she sensed on the porch was real or the mind's playback of her own movements. Allison was haunted enough to hear echoes of her footsteps as strangers. She tucked her shoulder and moved as if the knife were still in hand, though it sat quivering in the floorboard across the room. Leaves chattered outside, a night bird called, and the silence inflated with the feeling of an approach. Jacob peeled toward the back door. Kat pressed her ear to the front, caught the candle crackle and the faint tang of oil used on metal. Madison slipped along the side and peered through the slim pane, catching the brief silhouette of a pale-haired woman stooping to lift a metallic object and another figure curled in the corner. The choreography converged. Kat set her palm on the knob. Jacob found the rear latch. Chelsea loosened her fist around the key, feeling its teeth. Allison pivoted toward the screen as if seeking confirmation the camera was alive. The entry was not a smash but a natural swing forced by just enough force. Allison whirled. The energy she had hoarded sought a vent, but the violence warped when she faced not one but three, and their faces gave her none of the fear that would have fed her, only a cleanness of intent that stripped leverage. What followed was not a brawl but a chain of decisions made at the speed of pulse. Chelsea rushed not to the door but to the knife snapped into the plank so she could use the prop to unscript the scene. She bent without touching metal and pinched the blade with a corner of the cloth, twisted until it popped free, rotated the handle through the fabric to shun fingerprints, and sent it skittering into the sink where it chimed on enamel like a bell tolling a scene break. Allison stumbled, the tripod's legs tangling her ankle. Jacob reached it, detached the phone, killed the recording, and caged the device like both evidence and switch for the mind cord. Kat lifted Chelsea by the shoulders and felt the cold in her skin, the proof of living thrum under it. Madison yanked down the coat and found a spare key ring and a folded paper that opened into a shipping slip from the outfitter, a faded receipt for a knife that matched the spine code. In a breath, the initial questions found their surfaces. The rigged lens stood in for a witness because Allison wanted a legitimizing story. The wedding night demand was a tool for psychological binding and forensic noise. The knife had been part of the script from the beginning, and its provenance could be traced by anyone persistent enough to follow the logistical trail. The most dangerous element was not the hardware but Allison's fluency in turning any setting to her advantage. Kat denied her even a finger width of space to rebuild control. She moved Chelsea toward the porch, signaling Jacob to pocket the phone and Madison to gather the scraps. When they edged outward, Allison stood alone in the middle, body taut like a bow, her stare pinned to the small stain on the cloth as if it were her last certificate of authorship. Outside the night wrapped them, needling through leaves like whispers from an invisible crowd. The borrowed car looked miniature beside the forest's black ribs, but it was the only object with the power to convert distance into safety. Kat settled Chelsea in the front, clicked the belt, dropped a coat over her. Jacob woke the engine. Madison passed Kat her phone as the signal steadied, and replies pinged back from home confirming calls to patrol. In the car, silence stopped being a casing for fear and became a vessel to reorder fragments. Chelsea closed her eyes not to erase but to index the sequence exactly. Camera placement, the instant of the cord pull, the angle of the blade when it struck, the candle crackle, the low framing aimed at the floor, the run of digits along the spine. She understood that to step clear of Allison's web, she needed a story told in evidence rather than a storm told in emotion. Behind them, the house reabsorbed itself into the trees like a mouth chewing an unpalatable secret, but the secret had been pulled and named. At home, the Dupree family no longer walked circles inside a fog. Nicole surfaced, sat propped, hands still unsteady but eyes finally finding purchase. When the message arrived saying the place had been found, fear of collision transformed into a different vigilance. Whether their exit would be cut by the same anonymous truck, by a last flash of Allison's rage, or by some surprise barrier on the track. The road ahead had light now, their own beams painting it, their own tread marking it, and a specific address existed for anyone who needed to follow. The severed line had been spliced. If something remained as haunting as an etched batch number on a steel edge, it was memory of Allison's nested scripts. The witness was replaced by a lens. The wedding night turned into a cut across psyche and science, the injury scheduled as a negotiation tool. Each layer had been counterweight by an answering layer of resistance. The device had been killed at the only necessary second. The knife had been isolated from the victim's prints. The receipt for purchase lived in the pocket of the controlling party. The notebook's hints about a grandmother's house became a rescue map. The night ended not with more blood, but with the clean exhaustion of people who have passed through a designed ecosystem of harm that was supposed to digest them. It was a fragile victory, and strong enough to flip the field. If this story needs retelling to anyone in any forum, it will not be the sequence Allison had planned to flaunt from a phone on a tripod, but a chronology of action and evidence, coordinates and timestamps, and the names of those who showed up and held the line for what happened and what did not.